Chemistry of a cell. Topics for discussion. We'll talk about the vocabulary of chemistry, the types of chemical bonds, and water and its very special properties. Matter in chemistry is technically anything that occupies space and has mass. All pieces of matter are composed of elements of some sort. An element, that's what's on the periodic table, is a substance that cannot be broken down any further and still retain the properties that define it. You can divide something again and again, and eventually you'll end up with two atoms, and one of those atoms cannot be physically split without causing a massive explosion. Think atomic bomb. We'll look at those pieces shortly. When you blend two atoms together, they can actually react with one another, and then you end up with a compound. There are some very important elements in the human body. 96% of our mass is actually made up of only 4 elements: oxygen, carbon, hydrogen, and nitrogen. Depending on the individual, water is anywhere between 50 and 75% of the human body. Water is, of course, H2O, that's 2 hydrogens and 1 oxygen. The other elements commonly found in the body are calcium, phosphorus, potassium, sulfur, sodium, and magnesium. We differentiate between elements and compounds because they actually can be dangerous apart and essential together. Sodium metals, for example, are dangerous on their own. For instance, some sodium metals does this when you put it in water. Or while chlorine alone is chlorine gas, and that's used in chemical warfare. Typically, together, however, they form sodium chloride, which is table salt, and you have to have that to live. There are a few other very important elements found in teeny-tiny quantities known as trace elements. Having extremely low levels of iodine, which is a trace element, is something that leads to goiters, and that's what you see here. Thankfully, in the United States, the government has had the forethought to add iodine to our water and our toothpaste to keep this from happening on a regular basis. Now, let's look at those elements up close. There are some subatomic particles that are really well known now. The nucleus, or the very center of the atom, is made up of 2 particles. There's the proton. It has a positive magnetic charge, and then a neutron, and it's almost completely neutral in charge. Spinning around the nucleus in these big clouds at absolutely incredible speeds are negatively charged electrons. All elements have a known mass and atomic number. The mass number is what you get when you add up the total number of protons and neutrons together. The atomic number, that's simply the number of protons. That number never changes, so it's a really great identifier of atoms. It's the big number you see on the periodic table. While protons don't change, the neutrons actually can. When the neutron number is changed, we call those variable individuals isotopes. You can see normal carbon over on the left, the protons equal the neutrons, and then you can see a few isotopes off to the right. Isotopes have different weights, so they can appear different than the average element on something like a PET scan, because machines have been built to pick them up. They allow us to visualize different medical conditions, like cancers, as seen here. These before and after treatments, or before or after images from a treatment, show a particular drug in a study and how effective it was at getting rid of this person's cancer. Some isotopes fall apart and release dangerous energy that's known as radioactivity. Radioactivity can cause radiation sickness in animals and dangerous genetic consequences in plants. This is how some medical treatments actually work. We use that to our advantage. When cancers are exposed to radiation, the cells undergo organized suicide called apoptosis because the cellular level radiation has caused essentially sickness, and the cell pulls itself apart. When we look at atoms, we can know their shape and how the electrons are organized. The nucleus is always a dense core of protons and neutrons, and the electrons exist in shells around each nucleus. The first shell, or orbit, can only contain 2 electrons because it's pretty small. The second shell contains 3, and the third shell can hold up to 18, and as you move outwards, the shells become bigger and they can hold more and more. Covalent bonds exist because electron shells can overlap and share electrons with one another. The sharing of electrons will fill outer shells and make the molecule very electrostable, and therefore they're really hard to change. Bonds like this are often lined up in a straight line, and they're called nonpolar covalent bonds. In some instances, covalent bonds aren't lined up in a straight line, and we say that they're electronegative. They're bent at odd angles because one of the elements has a stronger pull on the electrons than the other element does. So we call these polar covalent bonds. This is water, and we know it to be electronegative. There can be bonding in which nothing is actually shared, and that's our second kind of chemical bond. So rather than rather electrons are transferred from one element to another. This picture is simplified, and it only shows you the outer shells of the atoms in question. The outer shell of sodium, or Na, has one extra electron, while chlorine in its outer shell is actually only missing one electron. Sodium can physically give up its electron, making its outer shell equal and happy, and chlorine can accept it, making its outer shell equal and happy too. Note that both of them is now going to have a new charge, though. The sodium atom is going to be a little bit more positive because it has more positive protons than negative electrons. So again, it's going to have a teeny bit of a positive charge. The chlorine, however, has picked up an extra negative electron, then it has positive protons, so it's going to be a teeny bit negative. So they're going to stick together because in an ionic bond, due to that itty-bitty slight magnetic charge. One of the most important types of weak bonds is a hydrogen bond, and it's illustrated here. It's the third bond you need to know. Water, as discussed before, is a polar molecule, and weak bonds form between water molecules. They're called hydrogen bonds because the positively charged section of a piece of water is the hydrogen atom. Hydrogen bonds help to create a protein shape, and they actually help to hold two strands of DNA together, and that's incredibly important. Your cells are constantly rearranging molecules and forming new chemical reactions or chemical interactions, so it's always breaking existing chemical bonds and making new ones. Here's a simple diagram of a chemical reaction. We've learned enough about chemistry nowadays to write out reactions in great detail. In every chemical reaction, the reactants are the starting materials. That's what you write on the left. And then the product, or the resulting materials, those are always shown on the right. We're going to go from this basic understanding of chemistry to studying water in a little bit of detail, because water has some pretty neat life-supporting properties. For one, molecules of water undergo cohesion, so they stick together. They undergo adhesion, so they stick to everything else, and they hold energy really well. Heat is actually essentially the movement of molecules in a given space, and water is great at holding on to heat. A solution is important, or solutions in biology are important, because they are a liquid consisting of a uniform mixture of two or more substances. The solvent in solution is what does the dissolving, and the solute is the thing that's dissolved. We say that a solution is aqueous when it's water-based, and what we have found is that water is largely the solvent of life. A lot of things are dissolved in water. If you think about ocean water, the water would be the solvent, the salt would be the solute, and we would call it an aqueous solution. In liquid water, there's always a small percentage of the water molecules that will naturally fall apart, and they fall apart into positive hydrogen and negative OH pieces. In some solutions, the hydrogen plus atoms can really build up for a couple of different reasons, and it causes these solutions to become acidic. That's the title we give a solution when it has a lot of H+. In other solutions, the OH will build up, and that's a hydroxyl molecule is what that's called. And we say that those solutions are very basic. We read these concentrations of H+ or minus OH as a pH on a logarithmic scale. The scale runs from 0 to 14. A pH of 0 is very acidic. 7 is considered completely neutral, pure water. And 14 is the most basic. Any deviation from the middle of the scale, say from outside 5 to 9, can be biologically dangerous, and we'll talk about this especially in lab. There's an issue that's important to bring up with rising pHs in the oceans. CO2 in the atmosphere is often pushed into the ocean when it rains, and it dissociates there, and it ends up lowering the pH of the water. The pH of the ocean is currently 0.1% lower than it has been in the last 420,000 years, that may not seem like a huge deal, but it really affects the health of plants and fish in the oceans. CO2 in the air rises, CO2 in the water rises, and it lowers the pH of the water. You can see that very closely in this graph. There's some CO2, of course, that's released naturally in the water from underground vents. You can't blame all the CO2 in the oceans on human activities from CO2 in the air, and you can actually see that CO2 being naturally released as it raises in bubbles from places called champagne vents. That's all the bubbles in these pictures. Coral at these champagne vents is highly variable, and studying the coral in these locations will help scientists to understand the potential outlook for all corals as the pH of the oceans change everywhere. Biological macromolecules follow the pattern seen in this video, and that's actually what we're going to study next, and it will bring us from a study of basic chemistry into the study of life in cellular biology.